The research and policy analysis group Opportunity Insights has recently released this economic tracker that allows you to track various indicators of the economy to get a sense of what's happening in relation to COVID and what states are recovering and how are they recovering and things like that. So they have these metrics that you can plot out at like a national level and see the trends, or you can get down to a state level and look at individual states. So in this case, this is sort of total consumer spending, and you can see the decline in April, and then it slowly climb its way back up. And you can add individual states to this. And I could look at other metrics here as well, such as like small business revenue instead, and plot it in a similar fashion. So it's a nice tool for quick exploration of this data, but it's also got some pretty predefined pathways, predefined charts, and interactions that you can work with. Now, what they've done is open sourced all the data that they used onto GitHub, so we can actually download this data and explore it ourselves. So I'm going to pull that into Knarr and show you a bit more about what we've got here. So they have some data dictionaries here talking about, we have some geo files describing the different states and counties and cities. They have this affinity file from Affinity Solutions, which gives you sort of indexed consumer spending over time related to the beginning of the year. So basically from the beginning of the year, what percentage has spending gone up or down, both overall and in different consumer segments. And that's broken out at a national level, but also pre-aggregated at a state level, et cetera. Similarly, they have job posting data, so we can see how job postings have changed and other things like business revenue and unemployment claims. I'm just going to analyze a few of these today. So what I'm going to do in Knarr is actually create a new project. We'll call this the Economic Tracker Project. I'm going to add a note for myself, just call it research. And I'm just going to link this data set here so we have that kind of reference back. And what I've done is I've already gone ahead and sort of cloned the data from this repository to my local computer. And it's a collection of CSV files. So I'm going to start with the burning glass state level data. So this is weekly kind of job postings and how those changed over time according to this burning glass data source. So I'm going to drag and drop the file here. And what I can do is actually inspect the schema here and see like what the different things is, and I'll insert the schema. So they've got the year, the month, the day, end of week, the state code, and then the total number of job postings or the index of the change of the total number of job postings, as well as that broken out into various sectors as well. So we're just going to load this as is for now and get that back. Now, the state indicator itself is just a state code. It's not super helpful, but fortunately, they've got this state information here. So I'll pull that up. Let's pull up the geo IDs for state. And if we look at those column names, we can link the state FIPS directly to this field, and then we'll have the state name and abbreviation, and also the population, which might come in handy. So I'm just going to apply that and load that table, and now I have this linkage between these two. What this means is now I can do some analysis of, by state name, but aggregating against these types of metrics through this association. Let's just call this our jobs data, and we'll add to this as we go. So I'm going to go into explore mode here and just start to plot some of this data. The first thing I might want to do is sort of look at overall trends, and I can sort of do this with the existing data, but there's some problems with it that I want to call out. So let's say I start with the line chart and I just put on like, the month here, and then we want to know like we'll just use average BG posts here, and this is where we're going to get into a bit of a problem, right? So this is the average BG post, and what this is really doing is it's taking the state index over time and it's actually averaging that index. And so we can see that, job postings sort of went up in the second month of the year, but then of course have gone down and now maybe are starting to climb back up here in June. Now this data was pre-aggregated. It's really important to understand that. So we can't actually get the national numbers by just taking the indices from each state and averaging them. That's not going to be quite accurate. And we can actually see that effect here. I can pull in the national data as well. So let's go ahead and do that. And what we're going to do is we want to link these just by the dates. So that's going to link properly, but these fields are actually different. We'll call this national BG posts. And I'm just going to comment out the rest of this stuff. We're not going to use it yet. And now what I'll have is an additional metric applied. That's actually the national level index that they were able to calculate with the more granular data that we don't have access to. And we can actually plot that instead. In fact, we'll plot both of them just so you can see the differences. So this would be the sort of state or average of state indices versus, let's just put the national one on there. National BG posts. And what we'll see here is that there is quite a difference, of a few percentage points. I mean, the shape is more or less the same, but we can't just average these state indices because we don't know how to weight them, right? We don't know how many job postings there were per state. This is just an index of change over time. So we have this national one though, at least. So let's go ahead and keep this. We'll go ahead and snapshot it and say, okay, we'll call this national job post trend and call out that there is, you can see some movement there. We could write some additional text if we wanted to. But now let's go and break this out by state. Maybe more interesting to see how this breaks down by state. Now, again, the national index isn't going to be useful for that, but what will be useful is the actual state level metric that we got from our data source. So I'm going to go ahead and break this out by row. We'll do state name, and we're just going to configure this a little bit to give ourselves more room to look at the data. And now we have a collection of the states. If we can see their various trends. This is in alphabetical order. Let's just change this. Let's call this. We can see most of them are following a pretty similar trend with some differences. So what I might do here is actually try to sort this differently rather than sorting it alphabetically. Let's sort it by like the overall value ascending, which means the ones with the worst changes are at the top and the ones with the most positive trends are at the bottom. So we can see like Delaware here and how that's been trending downwards and maybe slightly bumping up towards the end here. Wyoming, et cetera, having this kind of trend. Whereas if we look at the opposite side of the list, we're going to see states like New Hampshire where jobs have actually stayed pretty strong, just one small dip in May versus the beginning of the year, but then coming back there. And then Kentucky looking like having sort of a curve coming back up as well in Connecticut. So that's another interesting view, is just sort of seeing what's going on here with these states. Let's go ahead and capture this. Now, visualizing it was one way to find this information. If we want to find just more broadly, like who are the 5 worst states, for example, we could even do that just with sort of like searching. Like maybe we want to analyze, okay, these states, and I want to filter them and say, show me just the top 5 states by average job postings. This would be the best, the highest average job post changes. We could invert that to get sort of the opposite. These are kind of the bottom 5. And then maybe apply a filter on top of that and then do more analysis about, maybe I want to break this down and look at it by spending as well and kind of switch over my metric. So what I can do is go back to my data sets and just add more data. We have the affinity metrics at the state level that'll give us that spending information. So I'm just going to drag it on here. Let's just look at it real quick. This one is going to be linked by year and month as well, but it has lower granular data. It has it at the daily level, but we can still use our monthly level and continue our analysis that way. It's tagged to the state. We have all these different categories, which we'll keep for now. Most interesting will be, I think, spending all, which is the overall index. And we can also break it out by income level, which will be interesting too. So I'll pull that in. Now I have a linkage there, and I can come over here and say, well, let's just change this metric. These were the 5 states we figured out were doing very poorly in terms of the job trends. Maybe I want to know how are they doing in terms of the spending overall kind of index. We'll call this just spend index. And we can see that sort of trend here. And maybe I can capture this, spending trend for top 5. Or let's call this bottom 5, really. Bottom 5 job states. Now, of course, I can clear this filter and just look at the data for everything. And we can actually see that Delaware is actually not the worst in terms of this, where spending has gone down. Actually, spending's gone down the most in Rhode Island and the District of Columbia and California. And if we flip that over and go to the bottom of the list, we actually see some places where it's maybe leveled off, like Tennessee is sort of back to where beginning of the year levels were in Arkansas, North Dakota, things like that. Now, another interesting thing in the data set was that we have not just the spend, but spend by kind of breaking it out by different income brackets. So people that live in high income communities versus low income communities versus middle income communities. How is their spend changing? So what I'm going to do here is actually, let's just go back to the top of the house. We're not going to use the national numbers here just for time's sake. So these numbers will be slightly off, but at the national level, but close enough to give us a sense of the shape of data. So overall, the spend trend looks something like this, within some margin of error here. What I could do is actually add multiple measures here and say, instead of looking at spend all, I want to look at spend for all income high. We'll call this high income spend. And I'll just add another one for the middle income spend. And finally, we'll add one for the low income spend. And so I can see the overall trend is that obviously everything has dipped and is kind of coming back. Low income spending has not dipped as much as middle income spending, which has not dipped as much as high income bracket spending. Logically, it kind of makes sense. More disposable income at the top, which is easier not to spend versus if your spending is highly related to essentials. But we can also reproduce this kind of view across the states again, so we can go back to where we were and look at this by state name once again and sort that out. And we will find some differences in here. There are places like Rhode Island where actually high income spending is actually stayed more level than low income spending versus District of Columbia where low income spend more matches our higher level pattern of being not as down as spend in high income areas. And so you can look through this data and kind of look at those various trends that way. So one last thing we could do here is look at these metrics against each other, right? There's many more metrics to be pulled in here. There's several indicators that they've provided. We've done a lot of trending to date, but we could also do some of this analysis in a scatter plot. So let's say we bring this up and we want to look at maybe by state name again. We want to look at average jobs changes versus average spend changes. And so we'll get a scatter plot like this. For additional detail in navigating this, I could also add like maybe a bar chart for my state name with the average spend again, or maybe we'll do average job postings as an example. And let's just, for legibility, let's rotate it and sort it. And what's useful here is I can kind of interact with one chart and see how the data works in another. So for example, I could hone in on New Hampshire where job postings are actually like up overall and can kind of see where is its place against spending versus the others. So certainly it's an outlier in terms of job postings. It still does have a pretty significant dip in spending. So that's an interesting thing here. And I can explore through these points and look at the opposite side as well and see what's going on in these different areas. Or, of course, duplicate this maybe and we switch this over to spend and use that chart to look at outliers there as well, such Rhode Island down there, for example, which very low on the spending side, not so much on the job posting side. You could even try to compare these indices to each other. They're sort of, since they are indexed. I mean, we could create a chart like, let's go back to like the monthly charts we were looking at here. So we were looking at, while ago here. Okay, here we go. So we had this chart of like the income spending, but maybe instead of a metric for like income spending changes, we make this just overall spend. And add in the average job spend, job changes. And we can try to compare like the rate at which those have changed, right? So Rhode Island had jobs actually go up and then down a little bit, but that hasn't changed at the same rate that like spending has changed, for example. May or may not be useful to compare these indices to each other. Maybe there's some way to compare the overall patterns there, and just but the percentages themselves may not be so meaningful. But it's something you could do and explore in the tool, and then of course document your findings as part of a note. So I just want to share that as an example of what we could be doing with this data. I'm sure there's plenty more of insights to be found as we add more of these tables and build out a more complex associative model of the information for exploring and filtering that data.